We will start our questioning at this point. We will start with Mr. Caputo. Mr. Caputo, go ahead, 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank all the witnesses. We've had some wonderful witnesses here today. We have wonderful witnesses here today, but we've had excellent witnesses throughout. But this panel in particular really stands out to me. So Ms. Leung, Ms. Young, or Ms. Fung, and Mr. Fadden, thank you for being here. I only have 6 minutes, but there's really so much to ask. Mr. Fadden, I'm going to key in on the first note that I took from what you said. You said this threat has been with us for some time. Now, we've heard from different people, but you have a fairly distinguished background in this regard. How long has this issue been with us, and is it intensifying, or are we just more likely to discover it right now?
Chairman, I think it's difficult to, pick a particular day or week or month, but I would say that easily it has been with us in a noticeable way in the last couple of years of Mr. Harper's government. It existed before then, but I think that with the passage of time, it's intensified and it continues to intensify. I think the most noticeable increase in intensity occurred after President Xi became the leader of China. His activity is much more aggressive and proactive, and that's been manifested in all of the policies of the People's Republic, both with respect to foreign interference and more generally.
All right. Now, obviously, we take, this act is country agnostic so far. But have you noticed any other, the intensity from any other foreign state actors?
I think that, Mr. Chairman, China stands out. But I also think, as has been reported in the media, Iran is becoming slightly more active. I think India as well. And not just, the killing of Mr. Najjar, but throughout the community. And Russia operates, I think, in a slightly different way. They intervene. If China sort of covers the waterfront as much as they can, Russia tends to be more specific. They're more like a surgeon. And they do intervene. I don't think it's necessarily increased in intensity a great deal, but they're there and they continue to do so. Not necessarily through their diaspora, though. That's the one big difference between them and China.
I see what you're saying. So you've commented that there's been a fairly recent difference in intensity when it comes to foreign interference. Is that solely on foreign state actors having a greater desire to interfere, or is there something that's happening here in Canada, or a lack of enforcement perhaps, that is playing into that, if that makes sense?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, as I said a minute ago, China in particular, but also others, have become much, much more aggressive and assertive. But I also think that compared to our close allies, Canada has been a little bit slower in providing the state with tools to deal with this. I'm not suggesting that it's been ignored, but I am suggesting it's taken us a while to get there. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia have dealt with this issue, I think, faster than we have. Your colleagues in Australia, for example, have enacted a variety of pieces of legislation directly to address both foreign interference and espionage. So I think the main difference is when an adversary goes through a list of countries that it wants to attack, it will pick every country and do something in all of them. But if there's one that is slightly less organized, slightly less structured to push back, they'll make a bit of an effort there.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ms. Leung, you talked about, I wrote a quote here, interference targets individuals at the grassroots level. And you talked about even job losses and evictions, something that perhaps people in this room might not be used to hearing about. When we think of interference, we think of well, certainly I think of different things than that. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because you talked about the silencing of individuals as opposed to impacting government. We have about a minute and a half. Are you prepared to expand on that for that time, please?
Yeah, I can give a case study for both of these cases. So the job loss one was a community member from the Hong Kong diaspora here in Canada who told me that he was employed by someone of Chinese descent here in Canada and that person had very strong feelings about the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement. Now, it's notable that he came to Canada under the Hong Kong pathway after having participated in the pro-democracy movement, and his employer told him that it is not because of your political opinions that I treat you this way. And shortly after that, he was mistreated to the point where he left his position. The other case is a young woman who was renting a shared house in Toronto. She participated in a pro-democracy protest in 2019 in Canada, brought home posters, flyers from the protest, and then put them up in her room, which is her space. Her landlord then evicted her. And it was shortly after that that she found out that this landlord was, quote, a core member of the United Front in Canada. So that is a bit of context as to what that means.
Thank you. I see I only have 15 seconds, so I will pass the baton at this point, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caputo. We go now to Mr. Biddle for 6 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess I'll start my questions to Mr. Fadden. I appreciate a fellow lapsed lawyer. There's a few of them at the table, around the table on both sides of them. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how this legislation, balance providing CSIS with modernized authorities while still ensuring transparency, oversight, and independent review?
Well, I think principally, Mr. Chairman, the bill maintains quite a heavy involvement of the federal court in anything that's being proposed. Not to be trite, but a friend of mine was reading the bill and they said it seemed like an employment opportunity for the federal court. I mean, the federal court is mentioned a lot in this bill. If any of you were going to ask me if I thought that anything could be done to the bill to improve it, I would say to simplify it a bit, but I understand that there's a whole bunch of checks and balances written into it. But fundamentally, I think that the requirement for CSIS to obtain ministerial authority for the use of data sets and a whole variety of other things, both from the minister and then going to the court, will ensure that they stay squarely within the law. I think that the authority being given to CSIS to speak more broadly with civil society and the private sector will simply make these issues more understandable to everybody and will help an understanding of what these issues are. One of the things that struck me since I've left government is how little people understand about these issues. So CSIS going out there and talking to the private sector and civil society and getting feedback in the other direction, I think, broadly speaking, will simply contribute to an environment where greater transparency and accountability will be easier. I'm not suggesting by this that, all of a sudden everybody will be cleared to the top secret level and, it'll all go away. But to my mind, there's a pretty careful balancing in the Act. Again, if I had my druthers, I'd simplify it a little bit, but I do understand the checks and balances that are built into it.
No, I appreciate simplicity. Despite being a lawyer and the excitement of a make-work project for lawyers, simplicity is generally the best way to go. With the changes in proposed in C-70, how, in your mind, does this compare us with our Five Eyes allies, especially the U.S.?
I think it brings us very, very close to where they are. I think we have to be careful not to, compare directly. Our societies are different and whatnot. Most of our allies have had a registry for some time. Some are country-specific, some are neutral, as Mr. Caputo suggested. I think the creation of foreign interference as a crime goes a long ways to bringing us in line with our close allies. So I think if it doesn't put us at the forefront, I think it goes a considerable distance to, well, to be honest, I think it will lessen the concerns of some of our allies about the caution with which we've approached some of these measures.
You see this legislation having borrowed from other allies of ours?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think Australia is often drawn upon because it's very similar. Also, the United Kingdom. The U.S., it's a bit harder because their system of government, as you know, is different. But in respect to the United States, I think the main thing that this will accomplish is that it will suggest to them quite forcefully that Parliament is taking this very seriously. simply the creation of crimes, potential penalties of up to life imprisonment is a pretty powerful message that the country is annoyed. But I do think it's mostly the UK and Australia, with the United States likely being pleased that we're going down this path.
Thank you so much. If I can turn to Ms. Fung for a moment. You've been a strong advocate for the creation of a Foreign Influence Transparency and Accountability Act. Can you inform the committee of your advocacy work and consultations you may have had with public safety and your views of the bill we have in front of us with respect to that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I have, I have been involved in Hong Kong, and then ever since I have immigrated to Canada, actually I have been observing, monitoring, and also collecting data with respect to foreign interference and transnational repression for the last 3 decades. And I have been serving different NGOs and also coalitions and helping all civil society organizations to come to a common understanding about the magnitude and depth of, the foreign interference, especially the transnational repression, which significantly impact on the safety and also the freedom of expression of Canadians on Canadian soil. And yeah.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. I thank you. Just say thank you, everyone, to our witnesses, and I'll just pass it along. Thank you.
Merci. On y va maintenant.
Thank you. Then we will now move on to Mr. Villemur. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank all our witnesses, Ms. Leung, Ms. Fung, and Mr. Fadden. And Mr. Fadden, I'll begin with you. You raised several points regarding the bill earlier on, and I'd like to know in a few words how it could be improved. Well, that's a good question. I've thought about it considerably, and I think ultimately, given where we are today, I would say there isn't actually much more that I would do, as I suggested to your colleague. I think there could be some improvements regarding the federal court, but this is a good bill. It's not perfect, and I'm sure that in about 5 years you'll see that there are some things that need to be improved. But compared to our allies, it's not bad. Thank you. I did have a few questions about the independence of the commissioner. Now, from reading the bill, it's clear that that individual will be independent in their actions. However, I do have some reservations regarding their accountability and the Department of Public Safety. I would like there to be true independence, that person would be appointed after consulting parliamentarians, both houses. And I'd like to know what you think about that independence. Well, I think that independence is very important. And I think that creating a position like another officer of parliament is good. It's not the end of the world. However, if the commissioner is maintained as described in the bill, I would say that after 18 months or 2 years to ask that commissioner whether things are running smoothly. And the easiest thing is to create an independent position. What we want is trust and accountability. And I'm not necessarily biased against anyone, but I think it would be better for there to be a perception of independence besides it being truly independent. Now, so foreign agents will have to be registered. I'd like to know what you think about this double registration. So if you have a public office holder and you have a foreign actor, I'd like to know what that would involve. So there would be, if a public officer is registered and the foreign actor isn't, then there's a discrepancy. Well, I haven't thought about this. I think there would be advantages to having this double registration because, once again, it would be more transparency. On the other hand, I think we'd have to look at the unintended consequences of this. So I'd have to think about this. Chair, I would encourage you to ask your analysts to look into this. What would the potential consequences be? So you're talking about unintended consequences, and also it could become involve more bureaucracy, couldn't it? But it could inspire more trust. Now, I have another question about this cooling off period. Let's say before someone works for a foreign government. Well, I agree with that. When I retired, I couldn't speak to anyone at all for 12 months. So I think a cooling off period regarding potential activities with a foreign state is not a bad thing at all. As a matter of fact, I think it would be a good thing. Thank you, Ms. Fung. There is interpretation. There is interpretation.
Oh, how? Sorry.
Chair, I assume you're stopping my time? Yes, absolutely.
An extra 5 minutes, right? Well, can't blame me for trying. Merci.
Thank you. Interpretation, Ms. Fung, you are a lawyer and were involved in the idea of a registry. I'd like to know if you're satisfied with the registry as described in the bill.
First of all, I'm not a lawyer, but we have been working with a lot of lawyers with respect to the Act. To all our coalition member organizations, we consider Bill C-70 to be a good and strong bill. Yeah.
Merci. Madame Long, la même question.
Thank you. I have the same question for Ms. Long.
Also not a lawyer, but I'm happy with the bill as it stands currently. There are amendments that I would suggest, but the bill currently as it stands, I think, is better than what we have in our Canadian framework, and it is a good first step for this government to take to counter foreign interference.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Mr. Fadden, I have a question for you. You were talking about Australia earlier on. Now, Australia was one of the first countries to create a registry. However, there haven't been very many prosecutions. So are there technical issues with it? Yes, I believe that's the case. I'm not familiar in any great detail with it, but the intention of the Australian authorities was to provide an additional tool to assist the process. So the idea wasn't to have a huge number of prosecutions. If I understand correctly, there were 2 or 3 other bills that also involved listing various offences. But the idea of the registry was to provide Australian authorities with greater knowledge about who the actors are, but not necessarily give them policing powers. So basically some mapping, yes. So if you look at the registry as proposed here, do you think it's better than Australia's registry? I think ultimately that will depend how it's used, how it's implemented. Do you know, oftentimes something is legislated by Parliament, and then you have to see how it is used. So if the government chooses to have an active, involved commissioner who's going to make a difference, well, I think it could be better than Australia. And it could be a huge contribution. Thank you very much. Ms. Fung?
However, because of the rapid evolving foreign influence patterns, it is of utmost importance for for a government and also the future commission to conduct periodic review of the Act and all corresponding regulations on a regular basis. And what I propose is that because this time we are really competing with time, we would like to see the bill to be passed and enacted before the next election is called, to protect our national security and democracy. So what I suggest is that maybe we can consider reviewing and updating the Act and corresponding regulations 1 to 2 years after the 2025 election. And then after that, we can review the Act and regulations once every 5 years. The rationale for this is because usually during federal election, there will be a very good, exemplification of, the pattern, strategy, and tactics of foreign interference. So based upon what we are going to observe in the next election, that will give us more data to consider how to improve the Act.
Thank you. Merci, monsieur.
Thank you.
Mr. McGregor, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to echo my colleagues in thanking all of the witnesses for being here today to help us through the study. I don't think you're going to find anyone around this committee table who doesn't understand the importance of the issue that's before us. And I think that's why with respect to Bill C-70, it is quite rare to see that moment of unanimous consent to get a bill through committee this quickly. That being said, that puts a lot of pressure on us committee members because it is a fairly large and consequential bill, and we need to do our thorough review of it because it still has to go through the Senate. And of course, if the Senate finds that we didn't do our job properly, they'll amend it and send it back to us, adding to further delay. So we want to make sure that we're doing our job properly here. Mr. Fadden, I'd like to start with you. I take note of your comment that putting in a registry is not going to stop the clandestine nature of so much foreign interference. But of course, we do have very consequential amendments to the Security of Information Act, otherwise known as SOIA. However, putting a law in place is one thing, but making sure that we use that law to prosecute and then to convict is another. And I know there's often quite a wide gulf between what is considered intelligence and what is considered evidence, what would stand up in a court of law. What we haven't talked about a lot is that there's some pretty consequential amendments to the Canada Evidence Act to set up a framework to safeguard sensitive information. I know CSIS has to, by the very nature of its raison d'etre, has to be quite careful with the intelligence it has, because you don't want to get rid of an intelligence source. But at the same time, in addition to its detection and disruption activities, I think there's interest that we also want to see some prosecutions and convictions happen. As you look through this bill, are you satisfied that we have the legislative changes in place through this bill that can lead us down that path?
Thank you, Chairman. I think two sort of related answers. I think the authority of the commissioner to fine people, the standard of proof there will be less than that of the criminal law, and I think it will make it easier for the commissioner to impose fines than would be the case if you're accusing somebody under the Criminal Code or the Evidence Act. So I think on that side, it's a good call. There's still the possibility of judicial review, but the commissioner can simply impose the fines at a reasonable level of proof. I think the other crimes, some of which provide for life imprisonment, which is, to be honest, one of the things that surprised me about the bill, you still have the criminal law level of proof. And I don't know if there's a great deal that can be done without dealing with the old intelligence to evidence issue when you're dealing with the criminal law. I think it's an issue that we've tried to resolve for the last 20 years. Having said that, I think the appointment of special counsel and all these other measures will help. But I think part of the difficulty is that the rules of discovery in this country are amongst the broadest in the Commonwealth. So when we have issues before the criminal or the civil courts, everything becomes available. I'm not sure this is the statute to fix that, but I would urge upon you the view that it is a significant issue. And a lot of people have tried to resolve it. So as long as you have the criminal level of proof, I think you've done what you can. But again, I would urge you to look at this more generally in the future.
Thank you for that. Ms. Fung, I'd like to turn to you. I want to go back to your opening statement where you had some recommendations for amendments. And I just took note of how you were looking at the existing definition in Part 4 of a political or governmental process. And, you note that it covers, I think, six items there. But you wanted it expanded to, I think, include leadership processes, nomination contests, third-party advertising. Could you just walk me through that request in a little bit more detail just to help us understand?
The reason why we would like to advocate for an expansion of the definition is because based on our observation on the ground, foreign interference actually occurs at every single levels of, decision-making process, whether it's within the party or maybe outside the party. And say, for instance, in terms of political party, contests, we have also witnessed a lot of interference behind the scene. And of course, many of the proxies or advocates representing foreign countries, they disguise themselves as being Canadian politician or Canadian community representatives. And even in terms of, some of the other appointments, we have also seen a lot of unlawful lobbying behind the scene, which involves monetary, benefits. Sometimes it could be intangible or in kind. So I think I would like to provide a more broadened understanding of where foreign interference could occur. It's really beyond the imagination of most Canadians. But for people like us who have been observing on the ground, we have seen a lot more than what is being reported by Canadian media.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. That brings our first round to a close. We'll start our second round. We will end on this round with Mr. McGregor once again. So we go now to Mr. Motz, please, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And as indicated, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I want to start with you, Mr. Fadden. June 2010. That ring a bell for you? That's when you first started ringing the alarm bells for this country on foreign interference, and that we need to start taking notice. Do you feel somewhat vindicated?
I guess so, although my intention at the time wasn't to generate quite the excitement that it did. But, part of the complication at the time was we were very restricted in what we could say publicly.
Right.
And I just wanted to say that I was very careful to say that foreign influence provided some measure of influence. I wasn't arguing that, everybody was controlled, but yes.
So you make a statement that you're somewhat confined into what you could say. Do you think now that the provisions in this act give CSIS the powers they need?
I think so. I think
is there something more that should be added?
Well, I think the challenge here is going to be for the CSIS or whomever to set up a process because, to pick an example, because one of your next witnesses is from the Business Council of Canada, I think CSIS is going to want to have a relationship with the Business Council where they can share classified information. What does that mean in practice? Are they going to have to security clear them? Or are they going to have a parallel system? So a lot of it, I think, will be in its implementation. The Act itself, I think, provides a legislative framework that is pretty good.
So you have indicated, or not you, but concerns have been raised about the new commissioner. And they're appointed by order in council and without any parliamentary approval, according to the Act. Now, we've heard from some witnesses who have some concerns about that. They figure that the commissioner should be independent and have a similar role to the Auditor General, for example. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll repeat what I said to Mr. Villemure. I think the proof will be in the pudding. You could have the current appointment process go forward and there will be no problems at all. So I think the real issue is perception. I think we have a tradition in this country of having institutions like that commissioner be agents of parliament. Privacy, access to information, I could go on. To my mind, since we're dealing with an act that wants to promote accountability and transparency and independence, there would be an advantage to making this individual an agent of Parliament in much the same mode as the Auditor General.
Great, thank you for that. Mr. Caputo mentioned something about the country agnostic approach to the foreign registry. Can you discuss whether you agree or disagree with that approach?
I think I agree because if you don't have the country neutral approach, you're either going to have to list the countries in the statute or provide the governor and council with the capability of doing that. Also, if you list them, you're going to, without a shadow of a doubt, significantly affect our relations with these countries. I have a lot of problems with China, but China's there. We have to find a way of dealing with it. So I think the neutral approach is much, much better. Doesn't prevent anybody anywhere from dealing with the issue. But listing specific countries, I think, I'm not the foreign minister, but I think the foreign minister would tell you it's not necessary to obtain the objectives of the statute, so don't do it.
Mr. Luong, I have a question about the foreign registry for you. You had indicated previously that the foreign agents registry must encompass activities outside of political or governmental processes. Do you think that, as it stands, it's good enough the way it is, or do you have some recommendations for us that can be added to improve that aspect of your concern?
Thank you for the question. My view is that this bill is good as it stands, but amendments can be made to make it better. It is better than what we have currently in our Canadian framework, but much of foreign interference happens at the grassroots level, as I indicated in my opening remarks. So say, for example, if somebody that is advocating for pro-democracy movements in Hong Kong is intimidated, and to the point where they don't feel safe to do that anymore. They no longer write to their MP. They no longer go for meetings in Parliament. What that does for the movement is that it stops that individual from participating in Canadian democracy with their charter-protected rights. This is something that
Let me ask you a question related to that to some degree. So I asked Mr. Fadden about CSIS's powers to share information. And we agree, I think, that that's necessary. Do you think the Act goes far enough for the diaspora community in Canada to receive the information they need to protect yourself against foreign influence?
I think that will depend on how the Act is executed. I still have a lot of questions regarding what kind of information will be shared to whom and whether that will be sufficient for community groups to counter foreign interference. I think a lot of the problem with foreign interference at the community level is not that we don't know it's happening. We're very aware of it. A lot of our community members experience it, people at my organization included. I think the information sharing is great. We should know what we're facing and become proactive against it. But at the end of the day, it is our safety that we hope that this Act can protect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motz. We go now to Ms. O'Connell. Please, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I'll start with you, Ms. Fung. You mentioned areas that the bill should be expanded to include things like election financing, the issues around nominations in leadership races. I guess I want to, because it's my understanding that this legislation does include around the nomination of a political candidate, holding of an election or referendum, decision-making by public office holder, and proceedings of a legislative body. So my interpretation, and certainly I think some of the areas we're hearing, is that it would be inclusive of that. And so if there's language that you think is not making that clear, I'm curious how we could improve that. And when it comes to financing of campaigns, even as you mentioned an example of in-kind, that would currently be illegal under the Elections Act, and not, like, if it's not reported. And so that we wouldn't duplicate all of the election financing rules within this law. So how can we ensure that the language is clear that I'm of this assumption that, for example, a leadership race would be included, where is the language missing for that causing that disconnect?
I think in order for the Act and regulations to be successfully implemented and also achieving its original purpose, it is of utmost importance that the Act should be, wide, should contain, good definition of foreign interference in various aspects so that, the general public as well as enforcement department, they can base upon which to hold foreign agents accountable. And at the same time, I think public education is also very important because when I look at, the reason why Canada has become almost one of the most badly infiltrated countries by CCP, among all, is because there's hardly any meaningful, sharing of information of CSIS, right? Or maybe RCMP as, how general public, general Canadians can protect themselves when certain circumstances happen to them and how they can report this effectively in a timely manner to the concerned department so that the enforcement department can follow up on them. So it really takes, two-way communication in order to, get this act and regulations effectively implemented.
Thank you. Sorry, I just limited time and I'm trying to get questions to all of the witnesses. Mr. Fadden, you spoke earlier about the speed at which you hope that we move on this and the improvements, and no piece of legislation is perfect, and I acknowledge that. But there's also the suggestion about the independence of the commissioner and having it as a standalone, separate body. In your experience, that in itself would take time, additional time to have that body set up. Frankly, the space, the infrastructure that would be needed in such a sensitive role. Not to say that in the future that might not be the route of Parliament, but do you see that concern around speed of which to set up an independent body commissioner would cause challenges versus being able to use some of the infrastructure that public safety might already be able to build in and support?
No, I think it will complicate things slightly, Madam Chairman or Mr. Chairman. Having said that, if you treat the new commissioner as an agent of Parliament, what I think the Privy Council Office usually does is treat them like a commission of inquiry initially, and they sort of develop a structure around them. As I said to your colleagues, I think it would be desirable, but I don't think it's necessary. But if you find out, or if the commissioner finds after 18 months or 2 years that it's not working, I would very much hope that you would be willing to consider changes.
Thank you. And Ms. Lung, if I have a little bit of time, I wanted to speak to you about the horrific example you provided to the committee about the individual who was targeted, her place of business, her address, her boyfriend being communicated with. I can see up to this point there is no criminal offense to deal with that type of intimidation. However, through part of this legislation, although it wouldn't require registration on if it wasn't a specifically deemed political activity, but there would now be new criminal offenses that might possibly be able to deal with that situation. I recognize you've acknowledged more can be done, but does that help alleviate some of the issues that this isn't simply a registry, but there's also criminal offenses as well?
Thank you for the question. Yes, I agree that it is alleviating to the community to know that there are now criminal provisions for some of these acts of foreign interference that occur to them. I would like to point out, however, that discrimination is not part of what is in the bill. And as the examples I've raised earlier, it is a tactic used by the Chinese Communist Party and its proxies to target Canadians who are speaking out against their human rights violations. And that would be an important amendment to add.
Thank you, Ms.
thank-
O'Connell. On y va maintenant.
We'll now move to Mr. Villemure. 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Fadden, there will be an amendment to the CSIS Act, and that will allow the services to share information with universities, municipalities, etc. In the registry, however, you don't see these entities listed. Do you think that, say, researchers, universities, even crown corporations, do you think they should also be subject to the registry? Chair? Yes, absolutely. Well, that was quite clear. It couldn't have been clearer. Ms. Lung, I'm going to ask you the same question. So you were speaking about universities in your opening remarks. Do you think that universities, crown corporations, or municipalities should also be on the registry?
Yes, they should.
C'est la période des...
Well, these are very clear answers I'm getting today. Mr. Fadden, foreign interference actually hasn't been defined in the bill. How would you define it?
Il y a sans doute une bonne raison.
Well, there's probably a good reason why there isn't a definition. It's because it's very difficult to define. I would say, though, that it is the use of by a foreign entity of non-public methods to force someone in Canada to do something or to not do something. So at a certain level, basically, it's using diplomacy combined with intimidation. Right, so secrecy and intimidation, that's very interesting because I thought it was unfortunate to not be able to define a concept. Yes, go ahead. In listening to everyone, I would say one difficulty is the application. When I was reading the bill, I thought it wouldn't be unreasonable to ask the Minister of Public Safety to do an annual report or review, because there will be the CSIS on one hand, the Commissioner on another, the Director of Elections. But perhaps the Public Safety Minister could bring this all together for the benefit of the public and Parliament and report on that. Well, that's an interesting idea because normally CSIS and Parliament or CSIS and other agencies don't necessarily speak to each other. So there's supposed to be a 5-year review. But if I look at the Security of Information Act, I see that there hasn't been reviews that were provided for. So the government doesn't necessarily seem to be in the habit of reviewing its legislation every 5 years. Is there something that could be done? Well, one could say that the legislation ceases to exist if there isn't a 5-year review. Now, it's quite a severe approach, but it would be something like that. If the review has not happened, there should be, in fact, there should be provisions that no longer exist. Well, that's an interesting idea. Thank you very much.
Going on to Mr. McGregor. 2.5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Ms. Fung, I'd like to continue with you. There have been a lot of comments made about the urgency to get this act in place quickly, given the seriousness of the issue. The consequential amendments to both the Security of Information Act and the Canada Evidence Act, they all say that they come into force on the 60th day after which this act receives royal assent. So that's a pretty tight timeline. It's Part 4, though, the new registry, that is really up to a day to be fixed by an order by the Governor and Council. And I think, so we have the parts that are going to deal with the more clandestine nature of foreign interference coming into place relatively quickly. We'll see how well federal agencies can make use of those new tools. But the new registry is very much up in the air. You had made mention in your opening comment about, I guess, having, was it some kind of a commission to oversee how this act comes into force? Do you want that set up as a parallel to cabinet, or I just want to understand the mechanics of how you'd like to see this work?
Yeah, actually, this suggestion is based on, the Australian model. So they have set up an independent commission to oversee and monitor, the implementation of all the foreign interference related measures. I think in Canada, we do require such an independent commission to be set up because, and it should be totally independent of the government so as to maintain that neutrality and fairness in managing all the foreign interference cases. Yeah.
Thank you. And then you had also talked about having a review, I guess, fairly soon after the next federal election, just to see how these new legislative provisions acted in practice, and then having the formal review 5 years thereafter. Yeah, so that's what you wanted to see us
Exactly.
focus on?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to just end by thanking you all. Really appreciate your testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today. Your testimony is most helpful to our work, and thank you also for making yourself available on such short notice. As you know, we're under very short timelines to pass this bill, and of course you understand the importance of doing so. So thank you all. We will now suspend and bring in the next panel. Thank you all.